Hey folks, thanks for joining us today. I'm definitely looking forward to this conversation. So we're going to talk about mastering the transition from SOC 2 to HITRUST with my esteemed guests who we're going to introduce here now. I'm going to go first. So my name is Matt Cooper. I'm going to be moderating the conversation. I'm a senior manager for privacy risk and compliance at Vanta. I've spent 20 years in the information security, data privacy space. And the last decade, I've been helping folks with a lot of compliance readiness, things like SOC 2, ISO, CCPA, GDPR, and now HITRUST. So I'm really looking forward to this conversation. I'm sure I'm going to learn something as well. So with that, let me pass it to my first guest, Sanjeev. Take it away.
And hello, everyone. My name is Sanjeev, and I work with Precision Security as the Director Audit Practices. I'm a certified HITRUST assessor and practicing HITRUST since 2016. This is my 20th year in the domain of information security, IT risk, and governance. I have sat on both the side of the table as an implementer, as an internal auditor, and now as a certification body's auditor auditing for ISO, PCI, HITRUST, right? So looking forward, to this session, and it's great to be here. Thank you.
Thank you so much. Daniel, you want to do an introduction?
Yes, sir. Thank you, Matt. Daniel Hurtado here, Director of Audit, Precision Security. I'm a CPA, been performing SOC 2 audits since they were invented, actually. So SOC 1 audits for over 20 years. Also an ISO 27001 lead auditor and a whole bunch of other ones. Happy to be here. Thanks.
Thanks, Daniel. How about Mr. Bradley?
All right, excited to be here. My name is Sam Bradley. I'm the Director of Audit Partnerships at Vanta. So I oversee the partnership program, work very closely with Prescient here as one of our close partners, and helping our joint customers get SOC 2 compliant, but also HITRUST compliant. So excited to be here and talk more about that.
Perfect. And Matt, you want to do your intro?
Sure thing. And hey guys, I'm Matt Dadel. I'm one of the directors here at HITRUST. I've been with HITRUST for about 7 years now. And prior to this, I used to work over at PwC as an external assessor. So I've done the HITRUST assessments myself and some SOC 2s. But now at HITRUST, I oversee the assessor program in the HITRUST Academy. And I'm very much an evangelist of all things HITRUST, just promoting our brand, letting people know about our programs and updates throughout the year. So thanks for having me too.
Perfect. All right, guys. Looking forward to it. So for the agenda today, we're assuming that most folks joining the call have a general sense of SOC 2. However, just to make sure we're all on the same page, we're going to do a quick overview of some of the fundamentals of SOC 2. Then we're going to move into HITRUST. HITRUST, we're going to spend some time understanding the various flavors of HITRUST. And then finally, we're going to talk about best practices, tips and tricks for transitioning from SOC 2 to HITRUST, and/or expanding your compliance portfolio, which is the case for most companies who've already gotten a SOC 2 and now they want to add a HITRUST certification. Okay, so with that, let's start with SOC 2. Sam, I'm going to have you kick it off. Why don't you just start out giving us a general overview of the SOC 2 framework?
Yeah, sounds good. I'll go a little far back just to start, but this really spawned from the good old SAS 70 days. If any of you are familiar with that term, SAS 70 turned into a SOC 1. This all comes from the AICPA. SOC 1, of course, focusing on financial controls that are relied upon in systems. That led to the AICPA rolling out the SOC 2. This is a long time ago now, but the SOC 2 came to market and brought with it now 5 trust service criteria. That's security, confidentiality, availability, privacy, and processing integrity. And a number of controls sit under each of these criteria that the customer or the company can put in place to show to their market and their customers that they meet these criteria. And it's really intended to bring trust and assurance to the marketplace for companies to show their customers. And an important piece of this is the CPA component in signing off on these reports as an independent reviewer of these reports. So that's a really high level overview and background of SOC 2.
Okay, good. Hey, Daniel, anything that you'd want to add to that? I know you've done a lot of work in SOC 2 yourself.
Really, I mean, Sam described it perfectly. I mean, the SOC 2 has been around for about 15 years. I think the same time as HITRUST. So essentially what the SOC 2 is doing is providing, assurance on the design and operating effectiveness of controls that service organizations provide to their customers. And that's the whole point of the SOC 2. And then as Sam mentioned, it's an attestation that's required to be reviewed, completed, and signed off by a certified public accountant. Okay, good. And just so we're level setting for everyone, what are some of the real pros and cons of doing the SOC 2 scheme?
Yeah, I can start with that. You see some of them on here on the screen, but I'll add a little bit to this. For one, SOC 2, it's a widely accepted industry agnostic framework that's backed by the AICPA, so that brings credibility, and as we mentioned, signed off by independent CPAs. It's a great baseline security framework and an entry point for establishing a security framework and program for companies looking to kind of get in and establish a security program. It provides a comprehensive report at the end of the audit, and not just a certificate, which is what you get in some of the other cases. I would add too that the SOC 2 is becoming more accessible in terms of cost with the barrier to entry. The likes of Vanta in particular helping streamline and automate how companies prove compliance to the controls is one factor in that in making this more accessible to the market. Cons, limitations, in some cases the SOC 2, it might not be enough for companies that are working in industry specific areas that have unique compliance requirements and regulations that need to be met. The SOC 2 may not be enough, and so in those cases you're going to look to add on additional compliance frameworks. And with that, adding more rigor and maturity to the program may be needed. And something like HITRUST is a good example of that, where you can kind of transition from SOC 2, that baseline security capability and program, and kind of bring it up a level to the market to meet more stringent and regulatory requirements. It's not necessarily a silver bullet, the SOC 2 in that regard, but it's a great starting point.
Okay, perfect. So we're about to move on from this. Daniel, one more question. SOC 2 is often the first attestation, the first third-party audit that companies do, especially in the U.S. Why do you think that is? Why is it so popular?
What Sam mentioned, it comes from the AICPA, the American Institute of CPAs, as you can see here. So it's got that credibility, right? We come in, review the system description for whatever the service is, the scope of the service. We then, determine the controls that you're satisfying to, the COSO principles, for example, for security. That report, and then ultimately our review of those controls, the testing of those controls, and then ultimately the opinion that we provide is really the value and the reason why it's the first one, if that all hopefully makes sense.
Great. Okay, good. So I think we've established SOC 2 sufficiently for our audience. Let's move on here to HITRUST. And Matt, why don't you start us out? Give us a little bit of the background of HITRUST, maybe when it started, and like sort of the original idea or the need in the market that caused it to arrive.
Yeah, so it's similar in age to the SOC 2. HITRUST was founded in 2007, and the goal initially was to help organizations protect their EPHI. If you look at our logo on the bottom left of the slide, you'll notice the HI is red, and that's because it used to stand for something. It used to mean Health Information Trust. So we were very much in the healthcare industry back in the day. And over time, we've evolved, and we're now able to help all organizations protect their security needs. But healthcare is still a major pillar in terms of everything that we do. The thing with HITRUST is we have this thing called the CSF. That's our common security framework that we use, and it's the pillar for all of our programs. It's a framework that includes controls and standards from a lot of the popular and most commonly used sources like HIPAA compliance controls. It's got ISO, it's got NIST, CMMC. Recently, we've added GDPR. There's been PCI updates made to it. It includes over 45 authoritative sources built into our framework. And that allows organizations to get a very customized approach to manage both security and compliance in a more efficient manner through our certification and assessment process, which we'll get into in the next slide.
Okay, perfect. So following up on that, maybe Sanjeev, you'd want to take this one. So there's 3 distinct flavors of HITRUST. Can you just start breaking those down for us?
Absolutely, Matt. So E1, I1, and R2, the similarities and the differences. So let's start with E1. So E1 is basically the essential, HITRUST essential. Now, essential controls, the bare minimum, security controls to be deployed, okay, so that an organization can demonstrate their baseline security in place, okay, in order to secure their PHI or PII data, okay, when it comes to, having the cybersecurity controls in place. So primarily, E1 related controls are more focused towards cybersecurity, okay. The extension to E1 is I1, where the total number of controls are going to be 182 controls as compared to E1, where you will get to see 44 controls. Okay. Most important thing, to be remember here is that in a HITRUST assessment, there are 19 domains. So the domains are going to be constant. The total number of controls are going to vary depending on the selection of E1, I1, and R2. So if you're selecting I1, which is going to be 1 year certification, you have to go through 44 control assessment. And in I1, that is also 1 year certification. However, here you have to go through 182 control assessment. The best part is that if you have started with E1 and you want to upgrade to I1 tomorrow, then all the 44 controls, okay, against which you were assessed for E1 are going to be the same out of 182, which you will see in I1. Okay, and the gold standard, which they say, that is R2. Why that is being said as a gold standard? Because that is a highly customizable, standard where you have the liberty as an organization to decide your own risk factors. Okay, see, any control implementation is to bring your risk down, and you understand what is your potential risk, which you want to treat. So in HITRUST R2, you get the liberty based on your organizational factors, risk factor, system factors, okay? You design your own assessment. Generally, the length of the assessment or the number of controls starts from 235, and that can go up to 1,800 controls, depending on the selection of factors or the scoping details which you have to enter. This certification is valid for 2 years, followed by an interim assessment after 1 year from the certification release date. Okay, so in the first year, when you're going for this assessment, and let's take a hypothetical example. So 235 controls, if you have to get, assessed against, okay, then what you're getting out of that? The first thing, you will get a validated assessment report, which you're going to get for other standards as well, E1 and I1. Another thing which you're going to get here is the certificate of assessment, certificate of compliance. You're going to get the certificate of compliance for E1 and I1 also. But most importantly, which you're going to get in R2 is NIC-based risk assessment, thorough risk assessment report, which will not get in E1 and I1. Okay, so that is an advantage of going for R2. Another important factor is that, and let's understand this terminology. We may have come across to this phrase, are you compliant or are you certified? If you have been asked this question as an organization by your clients, okay, during RFI, when you're supposed to fill that, right? So how smartly you're going to answer to that question? HITRUST fills that gap. You might be certified for HITRUST, but you can demonstrate your compliance for 10 other standards, and that is what the beauty of HITRUST is, because it is named as CSF, Common Security Framework. So in R2, you have the liberty to pick up, okay, HIPAA-related controls, PCI-related controls, ISO-related controls, SOC 2-related controls, okay? So more than 40 authoritative sources, okay, if you think that there is a need of including those controls in your regular HITRUST assessment, so that you don't have to get audited, at different interval for different standards to show your compliance. Choose R2 because that gives you that liberty. So I would say generally these are the typical differences between E1, I1, and R2. And before I forget, okay, let me just add one more point, that if you are a service provider or a managed service provider and your clients want to inherit your implemented controls, that is possible if you're R2 certified organization. Thank you.
Okay, great. Sanjeev, very, very helpful context. Matt, I want to follow up on that. So I think when most people think about HITRUST, they really kind of think about the R2. I believe the R2 is the standard that's been around the longest. And, folks may think they know HITRUST, but they might not really be aware of the E1 option. Can you talk about, when that came about and sort of the history of what the purpose is there and what the thinking is from HITRUST?
Absolutely. And it's important because E1 and I1 are both relatively new. E1 came out last January and I1 came out the summer before. So less than 2 years ago, neither of these existed. The R2 is our historic, what we used to call just the validated assessment. It was the only option. And we heard the community, and the community was saying HITRUST is great, but it's a big scary monster. It's something not all of us can do, or we can't budget for, or it's overkill for our organization. And we took that to heart, and we thought, how can we create an assessment that still maintains the quality that we like, through our review process and through our assessor community, but makes it a little bit more doable, a little bit more affordable for organizations. And that's why we created things like the I1 and the E1. So 3 different entry points for organizations. And we call it the stepping stone approach. If you look at the slide, you kind of see they look like stairs in a sense, because each assessment builds upon the one before it. So the E1 is your essential controls. No matter what type of organization you are, what industry you're in, what type of customers you serve, you should have these controls in place. Every organization should protect their data at these minimal 44 controls. And you can get the certification that shows that you're doing that properly. Now, the I1 is 182 controls. So this is a big step. And this is leading practices for an organization. This is showing that you're not just doing the essentials, you're doing more than that. You're really valuing security, and you're doing all of the right things. You're getting an annual assessment through that I1 to prove it. The R2 is our gold standard. And because of that, it's a customizable report that Sanjeev alluded to. And that customization comes in where we have a tool called MyCSF, and through that you scope in different parameters and factors about your organization and the type of data you collect and the type of compliance standards you need to be compliant with. You factor in all those things, you press enter, and it will generate a unique control set to your organization. I'll say the average we see is around 375 for the R2. That does vary. Some organizations get far less, some get far more, and anything in between. The thing about the R2 is it allows you to meet the intersection of security and compliance, I'll call it, where you're focused on the security aspect through HITRUST, but the compliance aspect comes in when you factor in all those sources and you begin to scope them in. The bigger you build out your R2 assessment, the more compliance standards you can check off. Now you have one report that you can issue out and say, hey, we're compliant with A, B, C, and D through that one HITRUST assessment. It's a lot more efficient in that regard. Helps a lot of compliance management teams year to year when they're trying to go through their process and make sure they're staying in compliance with everything. This is the way they can demonstrate that. And I didn't say this yet, but it's deduplicated for you. So the controls don't just stack. You're not going to be testing the same firewall or the same password settings over and over. It's a deduplicated assessment. So that kind of blends very well with an organization's goals a lot of those times. So we designed 3 different entry points for organizations, and for some, the E1 may be the start point and the end goal for that organization, and that's fine. But as they get more and more risky information, maybe much more sensitive, maybe they're in healthcare, they tend to go up towards the higher assessment levels. And that's where we have that stepping stone approach. So you don't have to do it all in the first year. You can space this thing out and get to that R2 if that is your end goal.
Okay, perfect. So just to clarify, Sanjeev, I think, explained it very well to say, hey, you're HITRUST certified, But if you've mapped in these authoritative sources to the R2, you are effectively compliant with the underlying authoritative source or that framework. I believe that's just available for the R2. Is that right? And that the I1 and the E1 are not necessarily mapped to these sources in the same way?
Yeah, the E1 and I1 are static control sets, whereas the R2 highly customizable, and there's actually checkboxes you can pick when you're scoping an assessment that'll pull in different authoritative sources. Brings in more controls, but brings in more value in that regard with the R2.
Okay, great. So I can see it's clear to me, you have the R2, this gold standard. You have the E1, which is like a much more accessible entry point. What about the I1? Maybe Sanjeev, you want to take this. Is there like a clear use case for that one, or how should folks think about that?
A very good question, Matt. So I will not only talk about I1, I'll give you, an overview of all three. So where the difference lies, because if anybody wants to choose, despite whether it is entry-level controls or it's a gold standard, during the implementation, what are the differences they get to see? So if it is E1 and I1, the entire assessment is going to be carried out against a single parameter, and that is the implemented one. So if there are 44 controls in E1 and 182 controls in I1, the entire assessment, so all the 182 controls of I1 and 44 controls of E1 needs to be validated against the implemented controls. Now, what do I mean by implemented controls? I'll give you a classic example. If there is a requirement that antivirus policy needs to be in place, or antivirus needs to be implemented for all the commonly affected devices across the organization. Now, what is expected in terms of implemented control? So we need to provide the evidence that on our endpoints, we have implemented either McAfee or Symantec or any antivirus. What is the make, model, and version number? What is the latest DAT? Whether the signature is being updated, whether there is a central administration system, for managing the entire antivirus management system, whether the scan logs are, being preserved, as per the defined validity, audit logs are being maintained, end users are not able to change the configuration setting of your antivirus, install on the machines, all those things, right? So here, this is more towards technical implementation of that control. That is falling under the implemented part. So when it comes to R2, the assessment is going to be bit, scrutinized, more scrutinized, because the entire assessment is going to, entire controls are going to be assessed now against 5 parameters: policy, procedure, implemented, measured, and managed. However, for all those organizations who wants to start, for the first time with R2, it is an advice that, you can, it's an option that you can skip measured and managed parameter, initially, because too much data would be required, analysis would be required to demonstrate your compliance towards managed, measure and managed aspect. And HITRUST also gives you the liberty to be certified by adopting only 3 parameters: policy, procedure, and implemented. So here, the role is that every single control which you have seen in E1 and I1, because it is a replica, in R2, all the E1 controls are going to be replicated in I1, and all the I1 controls are going to be replicated in R2. So that means so far it was E1 and I1, you were getting assessed against the implemented controls. But the moment you choose R2, you are going to be assessed against 3 primary parameters: policy, procedure, and implemented. That means for every single control, you should have a policy document as a reference that this is how you have adopted that control. A procedure document which should list down that how this control has been implemented in the given, scope environment. And then comes the third one, which is common in all 3, implemented one, right? So this is the difference. Now, another part is the E1 and I1 are going to be assessed against the raw score evaluation. So for every single control, there is a maturity scoring pattern that starts with 0% and can go up to 100%. Depending on the maturity of the evidence, you are going to rate that maturity of that evidence between 0 to 100%. So 85%, and you are through for E1 and I1. But in R2, the assessment criteria is a bit different there. It is a Prisma scoring system. So if you have adopted 3 parameters, policy, procedure, and implemented, the minimum scoring you need to maintain, okay, for all your provided evidences are expected 75%. Okay, if you don't want to come across to a situation where you have to, face a non-conformity or gap or corrective action plan or risk acceptance. Okay, so these are the differences in terms of assessment. Now, as an organization, what will be the deciding factor for me to choose E1, I1, or R2? I will say very simple. Look at your business objective. What is meeting your business objective? If you are a small organization with 10, 15 people, okay, and hardly you get to see PHI or EPHI data in your scope, right? Then you may start this HITRUST journey with E1. Okay, if that is the requirement from your client that you need to be HITRUST certified. Okay, if it is a recommendation from your client that you must have R2 certification, you don't have any choice. You have to go with R2. But an organization, okay, who wants to implement this standard as a proactive approach, as a preventive measure, okay, my personal suggestion would be that not too less, not too much, okay, at least go ahead with I1 because it will have 182 controls, which is going to cover almost all aspect, where you will be able to confidently say that how you're maintaining the confidentiality, integrity, availability, and privacy of the EPHI, PHI data in your environment related to applications, infrastructure, people, process, technology, everything.
Okay, super. So I have one more question about the various flavors of HITRUST, and then we can move on, as we dig into some more details. Matt, I'm gonna put this back to you. Just talked to a mutual customer yesterday, and their customer, wants them to do HITRUST. I believe in their case it was at I1. They were hoping they could do E1, but there's a little bit of a disconnect there. How should folks think about that? Is this just something you need to negotiate with your customer? Is there like a pathway? What's the point of view from HITRUST?
It's a really good question, and it kind of comes into that question of why am I doing this assessment? And I think there's 3 things a customer typically asks themselves, and it's what am I required to do? What's in my budget, and what helps my organization? Those are the 3 questions they're going to ask, no matter if it's HITRUST, SOC, or anything else. But when it comes specifically to HITRUST, what am I required to do is a big first question to ask. If someone is asking for a HITRUST certification, well, there's 3 options. What does that mean? And a lot of contracts that build in HITRUST language haven't necessarily been updated to incorporate E1 and I1. So they may be asking for an R2 and they don't know about the E1, or that hasn't been updated in the contract language. So we like to say at HITRUST, it's always good to ask. Ask the company asking you for this assessment, what is their preference? What is the timeline? In some cases, we've seen instances where they're asking for an I1 and they will accept an E1, or they're asking for an I1 and they'll let you do an E1 in the first year and an I1 later on. So you can kind of do that stepping stone approach. There's different options available, but typically an organization that's asking for a HITRUST assessment, what they're doing is they're looking at all their different vendors and they're risk ranking them. The more sensitive information that you provide to each other, the higher risk you are to that organization. And if you're minimal risk, probably going to be an E1. If you're taking some type of sensitive information, I1. And if you're highly sensitive and you pretty much share patient data, if you're a healthcare organization, probably the R2, but the I1 may be sufficient in some cases. But always ask is the best way to go about that route. Assuming could create some difficulties that we don't want to see. We can try to help prevent if we ask up front, kind of thing.
Okay, perfect. That makes a ton of sense to me. And in truth, this company did have some level of sensitivity in some health data, so I can see where their customer was going with that one. Okay, let's talk a little bit about the actual audit process itself. So if I'm going to go do a SOC 2 or an ISO, I'm going to work with my auditor. I'm going to work with my ISO certification body. I don't deal with the AICPA or an accreditation body like an ANAB. Breakdown for HITRUST, because I believe HITRUST is a little bit different in that these assessments actually do get validated. Sanjeev, maybe you want to take the first pass of that?
Could you repeat the question, Matt?
Yeah. I was just talking about the nature of the audit itself, where I believe HITRUST is slightly different from SOC 2 and ISO in that the HITRUST organization actually has a role to play in validating the assessment. Can you walk us through that piece?
Yeah, absolutely, Matt. So here there is no competition between SOC 2 and HITRUST, okay, because those are meant for different purposes, okay. However, if an organization is already SOC 2 certified, okay, especially say for example type 2, okay, so they may have few policies in place, they may have few, and say for example they have adopted all the HITRUST principles, so they have sufficient policies, procedure, and technical evidences already in place, okay. Here, when they are willing to transition from SOC 2 to HITRUST, the most important part is that if it is R2, then you have to be more focused towards your policy, towards your procedure, because it is understood that if there is no policy, there is no direction. Okay, policy plays the role for directing something, accountability, responsibility, right? So, and we just don't want to be compliant. We want to be secure. It's a journey from being compliant to being secure. And if you're going for the gold standard R2, the ultimate intention is to be secure, right? Not just, being compliant. So the scrutinization, effort is more, okay? So you have to extensively, be working on fixing your policy document, procedure document. I can give you an approximate idea that if an organization is SOC 2 certified, okay, their existing policy procedures are going to suffice the requirement up to 55-60% in terms of documentation when it comes to having a proper policy and procedure document. Looking at the number of controls in R2, okay, because in E1 and I1, precisely the policy and procedure documents are not asked for because the entire evaluation is happening against the implemented controls. But when it comes to R2, okay, the extra effort needs to be put in for policy and procedure documents especially, okay, so that those are aligned with your policy statements. And then it comes to implemented. Now, technical controls are not going to be, very different when it comes to SOC. And I'll give you one example. And I think all the panelists will relate to this. What exactly we are trying to safeguard? Data, right? It's data which we are trying to safeguard. What kind of data? It could be credit card data, debit card data, then PCI comes in picture. If it is EPHI, PHI, then HIPAA comes in picture, right? If this is privacy related data, then GDPR strikes to our mind. If it is business critical data, then ISO comes to our mind. What is common in this? The common is the dynamics of that data. If there is a data breach, what is going to be impacted? Your confidentiality, integrity, availability, and privacy. And at what stages, okay, these breaches happen generally? When the data is at rest, when the data is being processed, when the data is being transmitted, and when the data is being discarded. Okay, and in order to safeguard, okay, from these situations, right, and to avoid these kind of risk, we deploy technical controls, tangible, intangible, in the form of policies, in the form of procedures, and in the form of technical controls. Now, what are the generic technical control? Firewalls, routers, switches, right, IDS, IPS, encryption solutions, WAF. So whether it is SOC 2 or it is HITRUST, is that concept going to be changed? The answer is no. Will there be a variation? Of course, yes, depending on the number of controls which is against which you are going to be assessed. Okay, depending on the maturity score which you want to aim for, right? If you want to, aim for 100% maturity score in your implementation, you have to deploy everything as it is asked in the control statement. But if you want to give an excuse that, hey, all my people are taking, or accessing my cloud infrastructure remotely, but I don't have a multi-factor authentication in place, okay, then that's your choice how you're going to deal with that control, right? So there you will be marked down for insufficient implementation. Okay, so these are the differences. So I would say if somebody who is willing to transition from SOC 2 to HITRUST, it is not going to be that difficult with little smart work. Okay, fix your policies and procedures primarily, and then leverage your existing technical control which you have implemented under SOC 2. Most of those controls can be mapped with HITRUST because these are the same authoritative sources based on which the CSF is built.
Perfect. Okay. Good. I think that's a great tee up, Sanjeev. We're about to transition more into focusing the latter part of our conversation on this transition element. Before I do that, though, Matt, I just have a couple more quick ones I want to knock off for HITRUST. So one thing we get asked a lot is, how long is it going to take me to get ready to do this audit? You know, and in ISO, you have this sort of squishy 90-day, you know, you should rule of thumb. Obviously, in SOC 2, if you're doing a type 2, there's a much more defined timeline. How should we think about that for HITRUST?
There's a couple things to factor in there. A, have they done any assessments in the past? So for instance, if they've done a SOC 2, that's a phenomenal baseline that they can build upon for any of their HITRUST assessments. That'll make this a lot faster. So typically when doing a HITRUST assessment, the goal is to get a certification. And to get a certification, you have to submit to HITRUST. HITRUST reviews every single validated assessment. And we only issue out certifications to companies that score high enough. Once you submit, you can't make changes. Once you start the assessment, you can't make changes. So the big thing is doing that readiness work up front, getting everything up to par for that certification level, if that is the goal. And it is for most. So what organizations will do is they have this big readiness window to figure out how long is this going to take. If they've done something like a SOC 2, less than 3 months is very, very doable for any of these assessments. But if you're just starting from scratch, and E1 typically around 3 months is a pretty common amount of readiness time. I1, I've seen it done quickly, but typically it's more the 6 months is a good average. And then the R2, 12 to 18 months is more realistic for an R2, maybe 9 months if you're very agile and ready to go. But that readiness portion is a huge factor in determining how soon you can speed up this journey and how hands-on the assessor is that you're working with, and what type of agility you have as an organization to make things like policy changes or process changes. But if you've done a SOC 2, we're not reinventing the wheel in terms of security controls. The key difference between SOC 2 and HITRUST, in my opinion, is SOC 2 is more open-ended in terms of how you create the control, where HITRUST is very prescriptive. So we'll tell you exactly what you have to have in place. So you may have a firewall in place from the SOC 2, and HITRUST will just tell you in a little bit more detail about what you need, but you may have in place already and it's easy to go. Otherwise, you may need to make a couple of tweaks and configurations during that readiness effort. But overall, having a SOC 2 as a baseline does make any of these assessments tremendously easier.
Okay, great. Just to follow up on that, I think that some folks may actually find it refreshing, the sort of the detail and prescription that the HITRUST controls have, especially coming from someplace where it maybe felt a little bit more squishy. Does that same level of detail and prescription carry through to the testing? Is that why HITRUST has this reputation for, rigor and consistency?
Yeah, and that's something we do pride ourselves on is we do check every assessment, and if there is an element that needs tested, it's a part of the review process. So when a submission is done, we have these things called external assessors. They're the authorized organizations that perform the HITRUST audits for customers. So Prescient Security is one of the external assessors in our program. So a customer works with Prescient, get the audit completed, and Prescient will package it and send it to HITRUST for review. Then our team takes a look, get comfortable with the results, and then we issue out that report and certification. Very much different than what you would have with a SOC 2, where the CPA firm can issue out reports with opinions without the direct involvement of the AICPA. So we review 100%, where AICPA reviews just a small handful as a part of the process throughout the year.
Okay, great. All right, so let's move on here now to this transition question. I think that's really what a lot of folks are interested in. So I've done my SOC 2. I'm convinced that I need to move to HITRUST, either to build my maturity, enhance my brand, or maybe I have customers that are specifically asking for it. I'd love to just open it up to the panel and lay out some kind of general best practices or any advice that folks have for how to make that transition, as smooth as possible. I don't know if Sam or Daniel, if you guys have any thoughts here. We haven't heard from you for a minute, but what can I do to really leverage my SOC 2 to move to HITRUST relatively easily?
I would just echo exactly what Matt just mentioned. Having the SOC 2 controls in place, obviously the more trust service principles in place that you have, security, availability, et cetera, the more you have, the easier it'll be to transition to HITRUST. Good point that Matt said is, we're not going to recreate the wheel, right? If you have your controls there, The HITRUST is more prescriptive, so definitely you'll need to tweak them a little bit, but I don't think it's that huge of a level of effort to get to that point. And Matt, you said a good point. You all review this, you evaluate it, you give your kind of approval, if you will. So that's a great thing for the HITRUST to emphasize versus a SOC 2. But having the SOC 2, obviously, you're already, from an E1 perspective, correct me if I'm wrong, I think you're already there if you're already satisfying a SOC 2 type 2.
Yeah, we've seen examples where customers have gone from SOC 2 to E1 and they had over 40 of the 44 controls already in place and ready to go. So we're talking about creating 4 controls. I mean, how long does that take? That should be pretty easy, all things considered. So definitely helps a lot to have that SOC 2 as a starting point for companies.
Yeah, I would just add a little bit to that. The bottom of the slide here really stands out. Mapping those controls together, the SOC 2 to HITRUST is super helpful in this transition, of course. And one thing Prescient can do here is they can bring that crosswalk of SOC 2 to HITRUST, and they can actually bring that into Vanta for our joint customers. And then the compliance checks that we're running in Vanta that are redundant or applied to both frameworks in this case can be inherited and applied across both. So you really only have to focus on those deltas. And it makes that traversability from SOC 2 to HITRUST better than ever.
So I know, Sam, obviously folks like yourself and others at Vanta, they can do this crosswalk. Folks at Prescient can do the crosswalk. But one thing that's essentially pretty helpful to customers, obviously the AICPA, puts out some sort of standard crosswalks to other things. Is that a document that's available for folks either from HITRUST or the AICPA? Is there like a standard crosswalk, or is this really, opportunity to leverage an expert? And anyone's free to take that one.
There is a huge, I'll let Matt answer it. It's a huge Excel spreadsheet where it's actually mapped, and it's available, right, Matt?
So there's an older SOC 2 to HITRUST mapping that it's a bit outdated in my opinion. That is available on the AICPA website. But I would honestly recommend working, if you're considering this option, if your CPA firm today does HITRUST assessments as well, they're familiar with both controls sets. They'll be able to tell you how close you are and help you with that crosswalk activity. We have a good amount of assessors in our program that are CPA firms, so it shouldn't be too challenging to find one. And then if you can't find anyone, ask. We have a lot of people in our program, a lot of experts that can help you with that one.
Okay, perfect. Anyone from Prescient want to speak to that? You guys are both a CPA firm, SOC 2 auditor, as well as a HITRUST assessor. How do you help your customers to make that transition? Any tips and tricks or things you'd want to highlight?
I mean, I'll take a stab at it first here. It's the evidences, right? Knowing your scope, depending on the SOC 2 and then HITRUST. It's the evidences and the controls that we'll already be reviewing. We'll save a ton of time, efficiency, also utilizing Vanta. We'll have all those evidences already there. We could utilize them for both, for example, doing both audits around the same time. It's huge by having, us, a CPA firm, and the CSF assessor. I think it'll be a great opportunity for organizations that want to make that transition from SOC 2 to HITRUST. Sanjeev, anything you want to add?
Yeah, I just wanted to, just add that definitely Vanta is a very good, point to start because that is helping, the clear mapping of SOC 2 controls with HITRUST. The earlier question whether, there is some resources are available. So HITRUST standard is freely downloadable. Okay, and when you download that zip file, okay, you are being presented with an Excel sheet where you will find the mapping of HITRUST controls with 10 different other standards. However, there is a catch. Those are generic mapping. When you are going for E1 and I1 assessment, you will get to see the fixed set of controls, 44 or 182. Okay, but the moment it is R2, it is very dynamic. So you will not be able to understand that what are the actual control statements against which you have to show your policy procedure or the implemented evidences. So it's always better that when you are taking the My CSA Portal subscription, you're creating your test object and generating your assessment there, okay? That is the right time when you start mapping with your existing SOC 2 controls. There you will be able to map each and every single control of SOC 2 with HITRUST, and the success ratio will be around 70 to 80%. Okay, you will not go wrong in your mapping because you have both the lists in front of you, HITRUST and SOC. But if you're looking at the generic Excel sheet provided by HITRUST, okay, which is freely downloadable, that will give you a fair idea, but that will not be an accurate mapping, okay, pertaining to your own assessment of HITRUST.
So, one more point that comes up for me, Sam, you're a CPA, you've been on both sides of the table, quite a few audits in your time. I presume using the same auditor or the same consultant who can do both standards saves a little bit of time and having to reacquaint them with your environment. Like they already know a lot of the controls and how they're going to map over to the next framework. Is that a fair way to think about it?
Yes, exactly. And related to that, it's pretty common. We'll see a SOC 2 and an ISO audit done together by the same auditor. This same principle applies here. And Prescient in this case can do has all the credentials to do the HITRUST validated assessment, as well as the SOC 2s and the ISOs and all that good stuff. So it's great to bring that together and streamline those compliance checks with the same auditor.
Okay, great. So we've covered a bit about using an expert who's familiar with both your organization as well as all the frameworks you're auditing. Let's talk a little bit about the tool. Sam, obviously, you and I believe in Vanta and its value point, and Prescient, we have quite a few shared customers. But for folks who aren't already familiar or aren't using, an automation platform, can you just give us some of the highlights, some of the features and benefits here that they can really lean into?
Yeah, definitely. So, what really makes Vanta so unique are the automated compliance tests or checks that we bring to a customer in their environment, where we are continuously monitoring their compliance status with over 300 pre-built integrations that we have today, and that number's just climbing. And of course, this applies out to multiple frameworks, which you can see on the screen here, and that mapping is all in product. So it's easy to tell what it's going to take to traverse across these frameworks as you mature and grow your compliance program. And then ultimately, we make this information available to the customer's auditor in the platform so that the auditor can quickly confirm adherence and apply their methodology and their procedures to that same evidence. And this really streamlines that audit process on that side of the house. And so we've got both panes of glass. You've got the customer side and you've got the auditor side, both meeting in Vanta and getting the information and only the information needed and not more to validate and compliance to what's in scope for the engagement, all in Vanta. So that's kind of like a high level of what it is.
Yeah, perfect. Anyone from Prescient want to chime in on what you've seen with customers? How this can be a helpful tool set to use.
Yeah, I'll take a stab at that. Absolutely. The tool is great for organizations where they may not understand where to house all this evidence, right? To make it easy for us, the auditors, to obtain. Putting it in Vanta obviously helps that process. We then can map it, as you can see here, automatically to SOC 2, ISO, HIPAA, HITRUST. And that helps organizations kind of determine what they need or don't need, helps us to kind of help them put all this together so that they can comply to any or all of these in a very, very efficient manner. And also it allows us to review their evidence, at any time. Once they post it, we're able to look at it. We're not going to be able to need to hound them down for that evidence, assuming the evidence is good. If it isn't, then we'll go back through the application and kind of get updated information. But at the end of the day, it helps organizations know where the evidence should be and for what. So that's super helpful.
All right, perfect. All right, guys, I think we have, really covered the lion's share of our topics here. I want to save a few more minutes here at the end to jump into some questions. I see we have a few in the Q&A. We also have one in the chat. I'm going to start reading through those, and anyone watching, if you have any questions you want to get in, now is your time. So first one, Matt, I can put this one to you. Can customers inherit anything from an E1 validated provider?
Yeah, that is a good question. So there is inheritability available for each of our assessments, varying degrees. Obviously, if you're doing an R2, there's more controls, so there's more to be inherited. But yeah, if you're doing an E1, you can certainly inherit from others. And if you have an E1, typically cloud service providers are the ones that kind of take the lead on inheritance in terms of making it available to other organizations. But we have a lot of documentation, so I can send the individual some more information in terms of our inheritance setup. But there is inheritance involved for all of our assessment options. Yes.
All right, perfect. Okay, I'm going to take one here. It's asking if Vanta is an external assessor for HITRUST. No, we are not. You can think of us as essentially a readiness partner, a readiness tool, and a validated assessor would be someone like Prescient here on the call. Okay. Another one, I got a hard one. How many controls are involved in meeting the HIPAA standard? Anyone want to take a shot at that?
I'll take that question, Matt. So it depends that, what is your scoping criteria and how many regular controls you get to see in your HITRUST. For example, that starts from 235 and can go up to, more than, 700, 800. So based on the critical risk factor you have selected, especially, okay, the 19th domain, which is related with privacy, okay, most of the controls, okay, are going to be related with HIPAA. There are 3 parameters: security-related controls, privacy-related controls, and breach notification-related controls in HIPAA, okay? And it is up to you. If you are selecting 1 out of 3, say for example, the regular one, which generally, I have seen people selecting the security controls. So say, for example, if you have 235 regular controls of HITRUST, then you will get to see an increase of 35 to 40 controls of HITRUST. But if you're including all the 3 parameters, then you will get to see an addition of HIPAA controls ranging between 75 going up to 110 to 135. So, net less between 100 to 150. It could be anywhere between that.
Great. Anyone want to add anything there? I see some nodding, so I think we can move on. Great question here in the chat. Madam, put this one to you.
Yeah, it's longer. I read it. If you want me to kind of take a stab at this one's.
Yeah, let's read the question for folks so they know what we're answering. Yeah, go ahead. So the question is, hey, I can do my SOC 2 remotely. What about HITRUST? Can I do a remote audit on HITRUST?
So the answer is yes, you can. So one of the few nice things that actually came out of 2020 with COVID was virtual everything, including the option for virtual assessments. So there are physical security testing controls involved in all of the HITRUST assessments, but we've gotten creative with ways of collecting evidence. So we've done things like live videos for assessors that are able to walk through and still get sufficient evidence to test those controls. So I will say the assessor team you select, there's different approaches. Some of them like to be fully remote, others will do fully on site, and some will do somewhere in the middle. Typically in the middle is what we see most commonly, but if you prefer to do a fully remote type of assessment, that is an option. We do have assessors that can do that with you, so certainly something you'd be able to do for this one too.
Okay, great. Good. Music to my ears, remote assessment. Okay, we had another one come in. This is actually another great question. So I'm clear that on SOC 2, I commonly will scope that to my, my production SaaS or my production infrastructure. How should we think about HITRUST? Is a similar scoping option available, or does it apply to my entire entity?
Good question. Yeah, you want to go ahead, Sanjeev, and start that?
All right. So we all agree, okay, that scoping is not decided by the assessor, rather it is decided by the client themselves, that what they want to put in the audit scope. That includes, okay, their application and supporting infrastructure, which is in the development phase, in the development environment, or they want to include everything or anything which is in the production environment. It depends on the client, not on the assessor. But yes, when we do the scoping of HITRUST, okay, then you have to primarily, highlight your primary application and the supporting infrastructure, okay, which is being used for storage, processing, and transmission of PHI data. So that is the only thing, okay, which needs to be paid attention to. Otherwise, the scoping is the decision of the auditee, not the assessor. Most importantly, HITRUST does not certify any product, any mobile device. HITRUST certifies against the implemented systems, implemented process. Okay, say for example, you are into development of an application, okay, and a developed application is hosted on Play Store. I'm not going to certify that application which is there on the Play Store. Rather, I will certify, okay, the software development, secure coding practices, software development process behind that. Now, that application development is happening in your development department, okay? And if you are going to own the production department, production department for any of your client, okay, and those systems are going to be owned by you, managed by you, however used by your client, in that case you should include that in your assessment, because sheer amount of PHI data is going to be transmitted through that application.
Okay, great. I see a nod from Matt, so I think we're good. Sanjeev, I'm going to give you that was the last word there. I think we've taken this to time, so I'd really like to thank all of our panelists today for the conversation.